Okay, so today we're really digging into something fundamental, right? This question of freedom versus compliance.
Exactly. Why do people sometimes just go along with things, even when facing, really powerful forces?
And we're exploring how how it works beyond just the obvious stuff like armies or police. There's more to it.
A lot more, it seems.
Our main source for this deep dive is an article by Larken Rose called Why Tyrants Win: The Power of Noncompliance.
Right.
And it's a pretty challenging piece. Philosophical, historical, gives you a different angle on why societies comply.
And also on resistance, individual resistance.
Yeah, we're going to try and unpack maybe the hidden psychology behind it all, how oppressive systems actually manage to take root and even thrive.
Which brings us right to the core question, doesn't it? What part does our own compliance play? Like, how much responsibility rests with the people themselves?
That's the uncomfortable part Rose really pushes.
Yeah. We're going to distill his main arguments, try to connect the dots, and show why understanding this is, well, pretty crucial, especially for you listening today.
So let's get into Rose's foundational point. He basically says tyranny doesn't win because it's strong.
Right, not primarily through brute force, tanks in the streets, that sort of thing.
Instead, he argues, it wins because of quiet compliance from the masses.
Which sounds backwards at first, doesn't it?
Totally. How could that possibly be the case?
Yeah.
How does quiet agreement overpower force?
Well, it's a stark idea, and Rose doesn't waste time setting it up. He actually opens with a really powerful quote.
Oh, yeah. From who?
From Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. From the Gulag Archipelago.
Ah, okay. Heavy stuff.
Yeah. Solzhenitsyn looked back at the Soviet mass arrests and, well, he lamented how people just cooperated out of fear, went along with the arrest.
They felt they shouldn't have.
He suggested that if everyone collectively had resisted, even with basic tools, he mentions axes and hammers, the whole oppressive machine might have just collapsed, ground to a halt.
So Solzhenitsyn himself is pointing to the power of saying no, collectively.
Exactly. He lays the groundwork for Rose's whole argument right there. It's about non-compliance having immense power.
Okay, so Solzhenitsyn observed this collective inaction. But Rose takes it further, right? He gets into the why, the psychology.
Yeah, he tries to explain the mechanisms behind this quiet submission. Why do individuals choose it?
And what's his take?
He argues that faced with a threat, an individual makes what seems like a rational choice in the moment.
Okay, like what?
Like comply to survive, give the mugger your wallet to avoid getting hurt. That makes sense for you right then.
Sure, seems logical.
But Rose says when that same short-term rational decision gets repeated by millions of people across society,
Okay.
it becomes this devastating pattern. It subtly enables the whole system of oppression. Short-term safety leads to long-term problems for everyone.
And that gradual slide, that makes me think of that classic analogy.
The boiling frog.
Exactly.
It fits perfectly here. Rose implies that if the heat is turned up really slowly, incrementally.
People don't jump out.
Right. Each little loss of freedom, maybe a new rule, a small tax, it feels tolerable, manageable on its own.
Not worth the fight at that moment.
Precisely. But add them all up over time, and the end result is, well, potentially catastrophic. It really pushes you to think, how do these small steps affect us?
And Rose doesn't stop there. He uses another analogy, one that's, let's say, even more provocative.
Oh, the human livestock one, yeah.
Right. He basically suggests governments view citizens like cattle.
To be managed, taxed, watched, exploited. It's a harsh comparison.
Definitely. And his point is that compliance isn't just passive. It's not neutral. It actively feeds the system.
He puts it very bluntly, something like, if the farmer is outnumbered by angry cows, he's in trouble.
But so long as they obey, he's safe.
Yeah, that's the one. It's jarring for sure,
Yeah.
but it forces you to think about that power dynamic. Who really holds the power if everyone just obeys?
And Rose doesn't just stick to philosophy and analogies. He looks back through history, right? To show this isn't just theory.
Absolutely. He uses historical examples as case studies to show this mechanism of compliance in action. It makes it much more concrete.
Like what examples does he use?
Well, he talks about Frederick Douglass.
Okay, the abolitionists.
Right. Rose points out how enslaved people, even knowing their situation was deeply wrong, often held back from resistance. Why? Fear. Fear of brutal punishment.
Understandable, of course.
Of course. But Rose's point is that those daily acts of obedience born out of that fear unintentionally reinforced the whole system of slavery. It perpetuated it.
Okay, what else?
Then there's Nazi Germany. He talks about how ordinary citizens often rationalized just Going along,
hoping it would blow over.
or someone else would fix it.
Exactly, believing things would sort themselves out or that staying quiet was safer, and that passive acceptance tragically allowed horrific things to become normalized.
Right. And then he circles back to Solzhenitsyn and the Soviet Union. Those mass arrests. Enabled, he argues, because people stayed silent, hoping they wouldn't be next if they just complied.
So there's a common thread in these examples.
Definitely. Rose argues that in each case, resistance, even small acts, if widespread, could have made the tyranny much more costly, much harder to maintain.
Maybe even deterred it.
Possibly. That's his suggestion. It really makes you consider the weight of collective inaction. What happens when people don't resist?
Okay, so given how much we rely on things like voting, courts, protests, Rose's next point is bound to be controversial.
Oh, yeah. This one definitely challenges conventional wisdom.
He claims that these traditional democratic tools are, and I'm quoting him loosely here, largely illusory solutions.
Right. Illusions. That's a strong word.
It really is. How does he justify saying that things like voting don't actually solve the problem?
Well, his argument is that these systems are, in a way, designed to make people feel empowered, to pacify the public.
You give them a sense of control.
Exactly. Without delivering fundamental change to the power structure itself. He says something very direct, like, you don't get freedom by arguing who your master should be.
Wow, okay.
His belief, as presented in the article, is that these systems actually exist to channel dissent, to prevent real resistance, the kind that actually threatens the system.
So, like, a pressure valve?
Sort of. He argues that the real fear of those in power isn't losing an election or facing a lawsuit or even seeing a protest.
What is it then, according to Rose?
Widespread civil disobedience. Mass noncompliance. That's what truly threatens the status quo, in his view. Which makes you ask, okay, if political action isn't the real power, what is?
And to drive this home, he uses a very specific and, again, very provocative example. He talks about the IRS.
Yes, the Internal Revenue Service.
And he calls it, well, he uses the term terrorist organization.
And it's crucial, as you said, to understand he means this literally within his framework, not just as like an angry metaphor.
Right, we're explaining his argument here.
Yeah.
So why does he use such extreme language?
His reasoning is tied directly to his definition of how power controls through means other than overt force. He argues the IRS uses fear.
Fear of what? Audits? Penalties?
Fear of audits, threats, financial ruin, essentially economic destruction to ensure people comply with tax laws.
So he sees it as intimidation to ensure obedience.
Exactly. He presents it as a political weapon of fear. A tool to maintain control and ensure compliance through, well, financial intimidation. Again, this is Rose's very specific, very stark perspective on it.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, the psychology, the history, the critique of politics, the IRS example, what are the main philosophical lessons Rose wants us to take away?
Well, I think there are a few key ones. First, it loops back to that incrementalism idea.
The boiling frog again.
Right. Small steps are the tyrant's best friend. Those tiny infringements seem too small to fight over until suddenly you realize you're trapped.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, and this one is counterintuitive, comfort can be a trap.
How's
Rose suggests that people who have something to lose a bit of comfort, some possessions, a decent life, they actually become easier to control than people who have nothing left.
Because they don't want to risk what they have.
Exactly. So, ironically, your desire for comfort can become your Achilles heel when faced with growing tyranny. It makes you more compliant.
Interesting. Okay, what's the third point?
Third, real fundamental change, according to Rose, only happens when disobedience becomes collective, widespread. One person saying no might be brave, but it rarely changes the system.
It takes mass action.
Mass noncompliance, specifically. And finally, related to that is the idea that words are not enough.
Protests, petitions, articles.
Right. He argues they're only useful if they genuinely inspire action, actual noncompliance. Otherwise, they're just tolerated steam valves, outlets for frustration that don't actually shift the power balance.
Rose really hammers these points with some memorable, pretty blunt quotes, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He says things like, every man has a dozen excuses not to sacrifice himself for freedom.
Ouch. That cuts deep.
And he asks those really pointed questions. When do you resist? After the door is locked? After your children are taxed into submission?
Pushing people to think about where their line is.
Yeah. And then there's that final observation, which is pretty bleak but powerful. You find the exact amount of tyranny people are willing to endure, and that's how much they'll get.
Implying that the level of oppression is set by the level of public tolerance for it.
That's the implication.
So, after all this, Where does that leave you, the listener? Rose's article isn't just some abstract critique, is it?
Not at all. It feels like a direct challenge. A question aimed right at the reader, or in this case, the listener.
About your own role, your own choices.
Right. And he connects to the future, too. He encourages you to think beyond just today. He basically asks, what kind of world are you leaving for your children?
And, critically,
How far do things have to go before you personally draw the line and say, no more? It really forces you to confront questions about your own agency, your own responsibility, even when things feel overwhelming.
so let's leave you with this thought, building on Rose's ideas. If tyranny really does gain its power from quiet, widespread compliance,
Then what small, perhaps daily acts of noncompliance might start to tip the scales back? Not just for yourself, but maybe, just maybe, for the generations to come.
something to definitely mull over long after this deep dive ends.